today. This is a very, very special event. First of all, today is National Indigenous Peoples Day. So we're so blessed to be able to have Bev Sellars, who we did not know before. I simply heard of her and reached out to her, and someone is a very special person when they answer a random stranger and say, of course, they will speak to your community about their experiences. So yes, Bev is incredibly special, and we're so lucky to have her here today. I've been reading her book, and it's beyond amazing. So thank you, Bev, for being here. Before we start, we would like to do a land acknowledgement. Mallory.
We would like to acknowledge that the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home.
Thank you so much, Mallory. So now I'd like to tell everyone a little bit about our special guest today. So Bev Sellars is an award-winning author, survivor of the residential school system, which spanned beyond Canada, throughout the United States as well, and beyond that even, and former chief of the Xatśūll.
Former chief of the
Xatśūll First Nation. Her 2013 memoir, They Called Me Number One, tells of the chilling details of being ripped away from her family, culture, and identity, and the lasting effects of her traumatizing childhood. She is very brave for sharing this story with the world. Her second book, Price Paid: The Fight for First Nations Survival, that's her second book. The book takes a look at the misconceptions, myths, and falsehoods about Indigenous people and their monumental contributions that have gone undocumented for centuries. So we're going to start this event with Bev sharing a little presentation with us, and then we will get into more of a fireside chat format where I will be having a conversation with Bev and asking some questions. And finally, we'll have some interaction at the end with the audience in terms of question and answer, and also a word cloud activity. So if anyone has questions throughout, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll come back to it at the end. Bev, please, please take it away.
All righty. Well, thank you everyone for coming. It is Indigenous Day and I was out for a while and the sun was too warm, so feeling a little tired, but that's all right. I always look forward to doing these presentations, and it doesn't matter. I was just telling Jordana and others that just a few weeks ago, I had students contact me from Turkey, and I love to hear from people once I've read the book or books. And so I always make sure that I answer people. So I'm going to start with a little presentation about my book, and I've got it written out. I'm not the type of person that I can just go out and talk from my brain. My brain is wired in too many different ways, and so I'm going to do a presentation, and it's a written presentation. So thank you to all those that made this happen. It's a privilege and an honor to be here. So I'm from the Secwepemc tribe in what is now known as British Columbia. My community, Xatśūll, is the most northern existing community of the Secwepemc Nation. The literal translation for Xatśūll means on the edge, because it is on the banks of what is now known as the Fraser River. So I get a kick out of telling everyone that I've lived on the edge all my life. I was chief of my community for 12 years, but I've been involved in one way or another all my life. There is a saying in the Indigenous world that if you are born Indigenous, you are born into politics, whether you want to be or not. I don't consider myself a politician and would never willingly choose that as a career. So in becoming a writer and a former chief of my community, I was acting on the inherited commitment to fight for justice for my people. The reason I wrote my first book, They Called Me Number One, and later Price Paid, The Fight for First Nation Survival, was that I felt I could give those people, whether Indigenous or not, who were like me at one time, the tools to correct the comments that are made. Ignorance about others many times turns into racism. And when you don't understand someone's journey, it is easy to judge based only on what you see or hear. But if you have the opportunity to give others knowledge, you also give them the ability to understand. So without a broader study and understanding of Indigenous history, the dominant society was left to create its own version of history. I knew that much that was said about Indigenous people was not true. My grandmother, who died in 1997 at the age of 101, told me stories of helping many of the newcomers to this land. But until I went to university, I still did not have all of the information I needed to fully process the inaccuracies put forward as history. I'll get into my book in a bit, but first I want to quote you a passage from the introduction of the book titled Hidden in Plain Sight, Contributions of Aboriginal Peoples to Canadian Identity and Culture. And this is the quote. History consists of the stories that we tell ourselves about past events. But what happens when a story is incorrectly told or missing altogether? When significant parts are missing, then the story is incomplete and understanding is skewed. If the story is incorrectly told, then our understanding of ourselves is erroneous. However, if there is no story at all, then humanity is denied. We do have opportunities and we believe responsibilities to fill in omitted story segments, to correct the stories that are inaccurate and to include missing stories, unquote. So history opened up a new world and a new way of thinking for me. European history was quite an eye-opener. I was raised on an Indian residential school and on an Indian reserve, and until I studied history, I had a limited view of how other countries had developed. So I grew up in the interior of what is now known as British Columbia. I lived very happily with my grandparents until I was 5 years old. However, because of racist Canadian laws, the following 7 years found me spending only 11 months in my home community. The rest of the time I was away being programmed to be something I was not. Instead of allowing me to be a Secwepemc child with my own culture, my own language, and my own traditions, I was being programmed to be a poor copy of a culture that had its origins across the ocean. My culture and my people were portrayed as evil, as welfare bums, as drunks, as dirty Indians, and were grouped in the same category as the mentally disabled and children. This had a devastating effect on me. And I start the book with this entry. I was 17 years old, desperate and tired of trying to fit in. All I could think of was to die. I was so young, yet I felt so worthless. That night, years of abuse and put downs finally caught up with me. And a silly incident was the deciding factor. Although any one of much worse experiences should have been the trigger, one small incident is all it took. That moment meant life or death, and I chose death. I saw no point to living. I had taken my mom's bottle of sleeping pills away from her earlier that day because she had been drinking and had talked about taking her life. As unhappy as Mom's life was, I still thought she had reason to live. Now, there I was holding the pills in my hand. I threw them in my mouth and swallowed easily. I lay down in the bedroom and waited to fall asleep. I did not think about others who were worse off than I was. I did not think about the family and friends I would hurt. I just thought about how lost and lonely I felt and how desperately I wanted out of this world, a world that seemed to offer only intense unhappiness. I did not have long to wait before I felt myself going to sleep, unquote. I just want to explain that I've had some throat problems. My vocal cords are bowed or bent or whatever you call it. I've been working with a speech therapist, but I will get through it. So just be patient with me. So my book is about memories and experiences of 3 generations who attended St. Joseph's Mission, a few miles south of Williams Lake, BC. My grandmother, who was born in 1896, spent 9 years at St. Joseph's Mission and then saw her children and grandchildren follow suit. My mom, born in 1925, attended the residential school for 10 years, beginning in 1931 at the age of 6, and me attending for 5 years, beginning in 1962 at the age of 7. The school that I went to remained active until 1981. The book originally was intended only for my family and especially for the younger generation who had no idea what went on at the schools. I wanted them to understand why there was so much dysfunction with their older relatives. Even my husband, Bill Wilson, who is described in the Canadian Encyclopedia as being the leading theorist in British Columbia Indian politics from 1970 on, and was influential in every major development, did not know what happened behind the closed doors of the schools. Both Bill's parents had gone to a residential school in Alert Bay, but they did not tell him about their experiences there. And even with Bill's 30 years of upfront involvement in Indigenous politics, he was stunned when he read my notes. I understood his ignorance of the schools because my situation was similar. My children knew that my grandmother, my mother, and I attended the schools, but no more than that. I talked to my grandmother and my mother and others who had attended the schools because we didn't have to explain to each other all the painful emotions that were a result of our time there. It was as if we shared a secret society. We all knew of the pain we carried and we knew the reasons why. And when I first started speaking to others who had not attended the schools, I couldn't do it without breaking down time and time again. But it has become easier. Bill encouraged me to turn my writings into a book for everyone to read. And at first, the thought of the general public reading my very private notes was unacceptable. But then when I started watching others who had attended the schools, I started to see the negative characteristics that I was trying so hard to overcome. Their behavior mirrored mine, and I thought I might be able to help them think about their actions. Also, through my book, I wanted to provide a voice for those that did not make it, like my brother Bobby, or for those who are still alive but have yet to find their voice. I hope my book will encourage them to tell all the stories that need to be told. Mine is one story, and the sad reality is that my story is one of the better ones. I have survived and done fairly well in my later life, but even within my family, many have not. Many charges of sexual abuse came out of the schools. 4 principals in a row at St. Joseph's Mission. 3 who went on to become bishops should have been charged. Unfortunately, only 1 principal was charged, Bishop Hubert O'Connor, who was there when I was there. And if the top man was doing it, it was easy for others to do so as well. Pedophiles were plentiful in these schools. In the book, I tell the story about my oldest brother, Ray, and his escape from the mission. What is not in the book are the memories triggered surrounding this event for my older siblings, Dolly and Pewee. They remember our oldest brother, Ray, hiding in the bush or trying to hurt himself to get out of being taken away again. Finally, one year, he sliced himself so severely across the chest with his hunting knife that his clothes were soaked with blood. Until the book came out and I told the story about our grandmother's memories of harboring her fugitive grandson, Dolly and Pewee told no one about this. My sister Dolly went on to become a social worker, and looking back on Ray's actions, she said, quote, "He was trying to tell someone he did not want to go back to the mission or hoping someone would ask him what was going on. My childhood protection training teaches us those signs. When we see them, we better pay attention," unquote. Well, of course, at the time for Ray or my grandmother, there was no one to tell who would listen or help. It was Canadian law for him to go to the school, and the school was paid for each head in attendance. No kids, no money. I remember later seeing the scars on Ray's chest when he would have his shirt off on a hot day, but I didn't ask him about it. I am not a social worker, but can easily guess the horrors that were traumatizing Ray at the school. If you treat people as if they are inferior and constantly tell them that they are no good, emotions will eventually build up and there will be a need to express itself. And many times this comes out in destructive actions. Drinking, drugs, and suicide can be the result of this. These are inward actions, but there are times when the actions are expressed outwardly as well. The chaos that has been imposed on us over 100 years has taken its toll in our communities. I compare it to a computer, viruses infected, now getting rid of the viruses. So people always comment that there's a lot of healing that has to be done in the Indigenous communities, and that is true. But it is equally true that the non-Indigenous communities also have a lot of healing to do. And I will illustrate this by a story. In my community, we have gang activity, not so much anymore, but still a bit of it. There are to this day rival Indigenous gangs that have been killing each other since about 2008. My community and another community west of us are the main ones involved. Very soon after being elected chief of my community in 2009, I was summoned to a meeting by the staff sergeant of the Williams Lake RCMP. He did not inform me what the meeting was about, just that it involved our community and that I needed to be there. I went with one of my staff. We walked into a room of approximately 25 white people. During the round of introductions, I realized that all the social service agencies were in attendance: probation, child and family services, welfare, social housing, and others. And even though there are a number of Indigenous organizations that cater to our people in the area, none were invited. The staff sergeant began the meeting and invited each of the organizations to do a presentation about the gang activity and how it was affecting their organizations and their community in Williams Lake. They had a picture taken from someone in our community who had posted it on Facebook. It was a birthday party for one of our young men, and about 15 of them posed for the picture. The staff sergeant said that those were the boys who were part of the gang, the Indian Outlaws, a name they gave themselves. And because I was related to most of them, I called them the Idiot Outlaws. I'm their auntie to most of them, so they couldn't say anything. As each organization spoke, I listened And the staff sergeant wrapped it up by saying that an RCMP member who was present at the meeting had spent time in my community working with the youth. He then turned to my staff member and I and said, "What are you going to do about all of this, Soda Creek Indian Band? These are your community members creating chaos in our community." I began by addressing the RCMP officer who said he was in my community working with our youth. I asked him who he was working with and why didn't I know he was in my community. The staff member who was with me worked with the youth, and his claim of being in the community surprised her as well. I then addressed the rest of the group, asking them if they ever looked at their role their society played in where my young community members were in their lives. These young people are born into a social system that is set up for their failure, and ignorance is a big part of the problem. Many times our social problems are attributed as simply because we are Native Indian. And so I challenged each and every one of those in the room that day who were too lazy to really examine their beliefs. I said to them, "What are you going to do to help change the living situations for these young people? What are you going to do so they won't join the Hell's Angels to get the material things they desire? What are you going to do to help these young people dig themselves out of the social situations they are born into? What are you going to do to change the structure of a society that benefits only people like you?" I also informed the staff sergeant that even though the picture he had on the wall were all young men from my community, not all of them were involved in gang activity. Labeling them all publicly as gang members put up more barriers for them and increased their chances of getting nowhere in life. Not much was said after that, and I left the meeting angrier than I had been in a long time. The staff sergeant came out to my office about a week later. He informed me that the RCMP officer who had said he was in our community had started drinking after years of being sober and had even quit the force. He then had the nerve to try to blame me for this. I had many fights with this staff sergeant, but in the end, we started to communicate. He eventually transferred somewhere else and we never became friends, but he helped make it possible for a few RCMP officers to be stationed in our community. These RCMP officers got to know us as human beings and started to work with us. The end result is that today, when we see those particular officers, we see their faces first and not their uniform. It took many years, but for the most part, many in our community, for the first time ever, can call an RCMP officer a friend. Along with our elders, they take our youth hunting. Haven't in the last couple of years, but they used to go every year. They had golf tournaments with the youth, and even some of the hardcore young men started to open up to them. One of the RCMP officers learned how to make bannock and makes it for our community gatherings. And he even entered a bannock making contest. He didn't win, but his bannock came a close second to one of our best bannock makers. The gang activity has lessened since they are in the community, and that is a win for all sides. We still have many problems with the RCMP, but the few that work with us in our community do their best to work with us. And as uncomfortable as it may be to hear, these stories and others of those who struggle need to be told so we can examine and understand how society needs to heal. Racism is a sickness, and privilege is a form of racism. Institutions were built that specifically oppressed Indigenous peoples and others. Privilege allowed the perpetuation of the same institutions to continue to oppress, and that has to change. We can't make the same mistakes in modern times. And I just want to talk a little bit about the recent find of the 250 graves in my territory, in Seguapan territory, in Kamloops. So the horrific find came as no surprise to many in the Indigenous communities who know firsthand and heard the rumors about all these children's deaths, and guaranteed there will be other discoveries, and I bet you at every residential school. When we were doing a memorial a number of years ago at the residential school that I went to, the elders were pointing in the direction to where the children were buried. And they weren't pointing to the fenced, well-groomed graveyard where people of prominence were buried. There were no markers where the children are buried. So I just heard in the last week that communities in my area are going to start examining, and I bet you at every residential school they're going to find graveyards, and probably quite a number of kids. In Saskatchewan, a couple of years ago, they found graves there, and I don't know why the media didn't. There were over 50 graves of children found there a couple of years ago. It was in the news, but it didn't take off like this one. Maybe the number wasn't enough, I guess. And we can't forget the many students like Chani Wenjack who ran away from the schools only to freeze to death trying to find his way home. And we acknowledge the late Gordon Downey for his song about Chani and for taking the time as a Canadian to really understand this part of Canadian history. There are probably hundreds, maybe thousands of Chani Wenjacks who did not make it home from the 130 to 140 residential schools that operated across Canada over a period of approximately 100 years. We also need to acknowledge the suicides and the fallout of many destroyed lives as a result of the schools. And there are other atrocities that many of us know about, but those stories may not be our stories to tell. There's been lots of chatter on social media about babies being thrown into furnaces and incinerators, but the media hasn't really picked up on that yet. Maybe it's just too much to handle. I have a story about that, but I will wait for the right time to tell it. I have to tell you that what did shock me about finding the graves was that the House of Commons and some provincial government buildings lowered their flags to half-mast. That, of course, should have been a given, but for many Indigenous peoples, we are so used to our voices being ignored or silenced. And we thank Canadians for this gesture in remembrance of our children. That is a small step in the right direction of acknowledging the whole truth about Canadian history. And the general public has really stepped up to acknowledge this history. And right across Canada and around the world, there have been people that are coming out and saying, calling the government and the churches out and saying, you need to acknowledge what happened. But one thing I want to say is they need to quit calling it a chapter in Canadian history. A chapter can be easily glossed over or skipped altogether. Our people were here before everyone else, and the Indigenous experience with the new people need to be front and center in every chapter of Canadian history. Otherwise, what they are writing is inaccurate. But anyway. So thank you for being here. I am more than happy to take questions, or Jordana, however else you want to continue from here.
Thank you so much for sharing, Bev. That was so heartfelt and so impactful for me, and I think for all of us here. I'd love to ask you some questions, and then I think we'll open it up to other people to ask questions as well. So my first question is, in your experience, how thorough and widespread is Indigenous education and awareness in the general population?
Well, it's gotten better, but I don't think, I mean, every time I go out and do a presentation, people are amazed at the history of this. And I did a presentation at the University of Victoria, probably just before the pandemic started. And there was an older gentleman that came up to me, and he was white, and he says, I have, I think he said 3 degrees. He had a doctorate and something else. I don't forget what that comes after that. He said, I have 3 degrees and I'm a very well-read person, and I have never heard of this, you know, and that's what people say. And, you know, like, and, you know, the history is told by the people that write it, and Indigenous people were silenced for so long, but with social media and with more and more Indigenous people writing books, it's coming out. But it needs to be in everything. Like, I was shocked when I got to university and they were teaching, I didn't want to take a history course, and I was shocked when I only took it because I needed 3 more credits and to have a full course load. And so I thought, oh, I'll suck it up and take a history course. Anyway, I picked the right course, and the prof there, she started the history course and started talking about history before the newcomers got here. And I was absolutely shocked. So it needs to go back into the high schools. And I have spoken to some high schools, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done to bring out the true history. And like I said, it's not a chapter in Canadian history. We're everywhere in Canadian history. So, but yeah, so it's getting better, but not enough.
Thank you. So, along those lines, what are some of the most important contributions that the Indigenous peoples of North America introduce to life and society as we know it today?
Well, I think the biggest one is individual freedom. You know, like when the newcomers came here, and I talk about this I begin my second book, Price Paid, with the contributions of Indigenous people. And there's also a website. If you go to YouTube and you Google my name, or Moccasin Footprint Society, I do a presentation that when I was working for the BC Treaty Commission, I was going to these treaty tables and people were negotiating treaties, and it became very apparent to me that people didn't even realize why they were at the treaties. Why are they negotiating treaties? They didn't know the history, even some Indigenous people. And so I put together this presentation and went around and delivered it all over BC. But I think individual freedom, I think, is the biggest one, because, you know, in other parts of the world, they had kings and queens and czars and royalty, whereas in the Indigenous communities, the chief always had to make sure everybody was taken care of before he was taken care of. And in one of my history courses at UVic, I was reading about some of the first Indigenous people that went to Europe. And for the first time in their life, they saw beggars on the street, and they saw the so-called leaders in castles and everything. And the Indigenous people thought that those leaders were going to be shot or killed, because that's what would happen in the Indigenous communities. If they didn't take care of the people first, then they were disposed of or whatever. And so rich versus poor wasn't, you know, everybody, if times were good, all the Indigenous people shared good times. If the times are bad, everybody shared it and helped each other, you know. And sharing was another thing, you know, that Indigenous people did. It was part of the culture. And in most Indigenous languages, you won't find the word please, because the elders say we didn't have to beg for anything. And so, you know, like, um, when I was asking them first about this, the elders, and they were trying to say there's no word, where that you have to say please. It's, you're expected to share. So anyway, so when the newcomers came, we shared with them as well. So
Hmm. I also, in your presentation about the gap in Canadian history, I also learned about that the Indigenous people showed the settlers how to, the land, how to move around the land and on the rivers and show them everything, and also how to plant in the land and how to survive in the land. So really, the people who arrived would have gotten nowhere without
Even though there was food all around them, they didn't know how to get it. And you go and there were forts, they established forts, the newcomers established forts before the Hudson's Bay Company, I can't remember the name of that, but anyways, if you go to Winnipeg to the Hudson's Bay Archives and look at the first writings of them there, they're waiting for the Indigenous people to get them food. And just north of my community, they said all they had left was an old bull, and they had to wait until the Indigenous people could hunt for them and get them food. Same as up Fort Simpson, so the Indigenous people brought all of this food to the forts, and the forts in the east shared with the forts in the west, and the west shared with forts in the east. And so in the particular one, the fort just above us, they gathered 23,000 salmon, dried salmon that the Indigenous people had done. And they showed, Indigenous people showed them like canoes and kayaks and snowshoes and dog sleds. All of that comes from Indigenous nations. And it's just amazing. And if people, I always say that, if the more you realize how much came from Indigenous people, the world has adopted Indigenous culture. So go on YouTube, and there's just so much. I could spend hours on this. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, when did the last residential school close?
1996 in Saskatchewan. Yeah, not ancient history. Yeah. So they began in the late 1800s, and they grew from up to 130 to 140 residential schools all over the place. And they operated for about 100 years. And it was, I tell people it was like a bomb, because there was a clash of cultures, because Indigenous, the way that Indigenous children were raised. And this is another thing. If you read about what the first people that came here, they couldn't believe how privileged the children were. Everything they were saying, if some, like they take the food out of their mouth to give to the child if the child wants it. And in being raised in my community, I know what that was. And so when like we were raised to be good people, we were raised to be honest, just good people. And then when we went to the school, oh my God, the treatment we got there compared to what we got at home was just unreal. And I tell people it was like the residential schools and all the legislation was like throwing a bomb into the community. And it just splintered our whole community in so many different ways. It affected everything. The connection between the elders and the youth. The parents were busy providing, getting the food, everything, and the elders, were spend a lot of time with the grandkids, teaching them everything in the language and how to be, how about living in, harmony with nature and everything. And so it was just this clash of cultures, and then the kids being taken away and raised in a different, splintered every aspect of our lives.
In reading your book, I was very interested to see that it obviously affected the kids who were taken away, but also you brought up what it did to the parents whose kids were taken away, like what that did for the parents and how they reacted emotionally and mentally, and maybe they started drinking and maybe they couldn't deal with the emotional aspect of that. So I really see what you're saying, that it affected everything.
They knew what was going to happen to the kids, and they were powerless to do anything. My grandmother, every year, every time we were going to be taken back to the residential school, she would let us know how much she hated to send us there, but she said, but we'll go to jail if we don't, if we don't let you go. And that's true. In my area, some parents went to jail. And, there was one family that moved their whole family down to the USA because they didn't want their kids going to residential school. But that wasn't an option. That would have never been an option for my grandmother. She didn't have the means. I mean, that family, those parents could work down in the United States. So that's how a few got away.
So I have one more question for you, and then I think we will, well, Joelle has a question. I'm wondering, Jen, do you think we should do the interactive activity before questions, or people can do Q&A first?
If you want to ask the last question you had, and then we can have one or two from the group, then the word cloud, or we could do the word cloud first.
Okay, that sounds good. So my last question for you, Bev, is what can we do? What message would you like to leave us with today? What can be done now to address this history and this present experience and the horrific things that we're learning about today? What can we all do? Can we do anything? And if so, what can we do?
Well, humans are horrible creatures to sometimes, but there is hope that we can all become civilized. And, in whatever territory you're in, find out what that particular tribe, and there's nowhere you can go in Canada where there isn't a tribe. I mean, the whole area is occupied by Indigenous people. So, find out from them. I mean, I can tell you what you can do in my area, but I can't say, my neighboring tribes what they want. So, and, go to your MLAs, go to your MPs, write letters. The Indigenous people we're still seeking justice for and our rightful place in society. And I think I'm part of a group, it's called the Indigenous Leadership Initiative. And there are statistics that show where Indigenous people are looking after the land, that those areas are the best places in the world where Indigenous people are looking after it. So we have, we want guardians out on the land. We want our people out there because we see the effects first. And it's good, but it's going to affect everybody. So, in my area, I would like people in the Williams Lake area and the Caribou to push for just and right treaties, not watered down crap that they are trying to give us, and for Indigenous people to be part of, the decision making in the land. My sister Tina, she's the hunter in the family, and she used to be. She's not so much anymore. Her sons have taken it over, but she would go out and she would come back and she would be just angry because, they logged off a moose calving area. They don't understand, the relationship. And so people are making these decisions in Ottawa or Victoria or in Williams Lake without understanding it. So we need to be out there on the land. And so there's so many things, and I would encourage people just to talk to, get some advice from the tribes in your area.
So you're saying that the Indigenous people do not have decision-making ability over their land, their reserves?
Very little, yeah. And we need to have that. Yep.
Well, I think it all starts here with learning about these issues and becoming aware that these things are occurring. And from here we can do more, hopefully. So let's take a few questions. Sorry, what did you say?
It's not just for, everything is connected, and it's not just the Indigenous people that are going to benefit from it. It'll be everybody. You know, we can't say, oh, we're going to protect our little area and we're going to survive. Everything is connected. You know, so what happens in the interior is going to affect the coastal people. What happens in BC is going to affect other people, you know, in Alberta. And so, yeah, it's
Wow.
all connected.
So let's take a couple questions from the audience, and then we'll move to an interactive activity. Joelle, I know your hand went up first, and we'd love to hear your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for speaking, Bev. I learned a lot and really appreciate your courage and bravery in sharing with us. I had a couple related questions. So you mentioned that you were able to go back to family before being sent back to residential schools. And I was wondering if that's commonplace to be able for people who are sent to residential schools to like return home to their families for breaks and go back, or were some people there for years and years without seeing their family at all?
Yeah, I luckily had my grandparents at a stable home to go to. So I went home for 2 weeks at Christmas time and the months of July and August. So yeah, but my mom, she was only allowed, I think it was the month of July, and my grandmother stayed there for, she didn't go home. She stayed there for 9 or 10 years.
Wow.
So her mom died while she was at the school, and her dad had to fight like heck to get his 2 girls out so they could attend their mom's funeral. The priests weren't going to allow it, but he managed. He wouldn't leave until he had his daughters. But other than that, they were there the whole time.
That's awesome.
And there were some kids when I was there, their lives were in such chaos, or they're, you know, at home, that they didn't really, you know, their parents were not able to look after them, but they, you know, like, and they blamed their parents, but they failed to look, you know, well, their parents went to the residential school too, and then their grandparents went, you know, and the chaos just, it was all just spinning out of control, you know. And so there were some kids that stayed there year round while I was there.
And can I ask another question, Jordana?
Yeah, sure.
My other question was, after children were finally released from the residential schools, they finished their time there. Were there some who had no connection with their families because of all the time away, or were most able to reunite?
I think it was really difficult for some. I mean, there were, especially up in the Inuit people, you know, they were gone for years and years, and you know, it was, and even for some at the school that I went to, they, you know, they might have spoke their language while they were home, but when they got to the school and you were strapped for, yeah, you know, I didn't know my grandmother was fluent in her language until she was in her 90s. She never spoke a word of her language, even though, you know, her sister lived not too far away. And my grandmother didn't get emotional very often. And I told her, Gram, how come you didn't speak your language? And she says, they whipped us, you know, and they must have really whipped her. And she learned, she never ever spoke it. So it was difficult. And, you know, like just, I mean, everybody was suffering. It wasn't like you went home to a functional family. Your parents and your grandparents went to the residential school, so they were dealing with it. So you went home, and it, you know, your whole community, my whole community went to the school, you know, and everybody was dealing with their problems. It wasn't like there was I mean, we had a bit of safety, especially I did with my grandparents, but most people were, you know, it was chaos.
Wow. Thank you for sharing.
Mhm.
It's just awful. And I'm so sorry that you and your family and communities had to go through this. And I really hope that we can work together toward reconciliation.
I'd like to read out another question from someone here today. So Bev, I would like to know what your perspective on Canada Day is, especially with recent calls to cancel the day.
I guess you'd cancel it
can-
altogether.
You don't need to answer anything you
No,
don't
I
want.
don't mind. You know, it really bothers me. You know, there's all this jubilation about Canada Day, but the history of Canada is not acknowledged, and so I've never celebrated Canada Day. I just stay away from it, and you know, like I think that the more people know about Canada, not just with Indigenous people, there's been just, oh my gosh, there's just been so much discrimination to all kinds of people, you know, like, and until we get there, how the heck can anybody celebrate Canada? I don't know. It just, I don't know. So I don't celebrate it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. It's really hard, especially given your own personal experiences. We have some Holocaust survivors in our audience today, and I think you know, personal, very traumatizing experiences can leave us with deep scars that really never go away or
Yeah.
stay for a very, very long time.
I had the honor of speaking to a Holocaust conference at the University of Victoria a few years ago. And I realized then how important it is to hear firsthand from people that have gone through that. There were some survivors there and they were telling their stories. And oh my God, I was, you know, I knew about it. It's not that I didn't know about the Holocaust. It's not that I didn't know, know the history and whatever. But until you hear somebody personally speak about their experience, it just, like it just hit me right, just boom, boom in the heart. And so I know, so when I go out, I know it's important to speak about the schools and to let people know what happened.
Thank you. Let's take one more question, and then I think we're going to move on to the word cloud. And if you'd like to stay after, people can stay after to speak to you for a few minutes. This is actually my father, Sidney Leibowitz. Daddy.
Hello. You mentioned earlier that a family went down to the United States to, look for a better life, so to speak. What I was wondering was, how would you judge the American treatment of the Indigenous peoples versus the Canadian treatment of the Indigenous peoples overall, like on a global scale? And similarly, like, would Indigenous people in the United States be celebrating the 4th of July? How would they feel towards America? In other words, is America, I'm not saying Canada was good. Obviously, you're giving us the perspective here that Canada did some terrible things. But I'm wondering, is the Americans, were they the same? Were they better? Were they worse? And how do Indigenous people in America look towards their 4th of July holiday, the country that now rules over them?
To be honest with you, I've never spoken. I know there's a lot of Indigenous people, and the history is absolutely terrible. But I know that they feel the same way about their history as we do in Canada. I don't know whether they celebrate the 4th of July. I couldn't say. But the family that went down there, because they weren't American citizens, they couldn't be sent to the residential school. So, but there were residential schools there as well, and in Australia. So, and they were all so similar. It's amazing. It's like these people that ran the schools went to a training session about how to run residential schools. And even I talked about, and when we first started talking about residential schools, I thought it was just our area, and maybe one or two other residential schools that were so horrible because, we didn't have social media. But then once our tribal council started bringing it out and we started talking to people across Canada, I was just amazed, at how similar they were. Just, in the book, I talk about having new shoes, not wanting new shoes because, you know, like you didn't want to feel like you were better than anybody else, because you would get a punch or whatever. And then there was a guy from back east, and he said he was the unlucky one to get the new shoes. He'd go out right away and scuff it up all so that it looked like old shoes. So it was just amazing, yeah. And now the
Wow.
stories coming out about the babies thrown in the furnaces and the incinerators. I was wondering about that because I knew of that story. My aunt was part of that story, and I knew about a baby, and that baby was a live baby, not a dead baby. And they took it out of the incinerator. But anyways, but now on social media, and there are people at residential schools all over that are talking about the incinerators and the furnaces. And I don't know if it was just babies or children, but one guy said if there were furnaces, you're not going to find bodies. So I don't know.
Wow. I encourage everyone here to order and read Bev's books, one or both. The first one is called They Called Me Number One, which I think many people who learn Holocaust history would know about the idea of numbering human beings, which is something that Bev and students at the residential school experienced. And in Bev's book, you say, you remember your number, your mom remembers her number, your grams remembers her number. For the rest of their lives, they remember that number that they were called at school. So we just put the link in the chat for her book, if anyone for that book, if anyone wants to order that, which I highly suggest. Would it be okay if we move on to the word cloud opportunity now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, wonderful. Jen, take it away.
I know that there are likely many more questions, and I'm hoping that this word cloud activity will give everyone here a chance to participate on a wider scale. So what I've done now is I've put in the chat the link to the word cloud. So if you want to participate, please click on that link and let me know if it's working for you. I'm also going to share my screen, and we'll see the thoughts come in as people start to engage with that link. And the prompt is, what is something new you learned? So everyone can write in something new that they've learned. 1, 2, 3 things, as many as you'd like from this talk that Bev so graciously gave us. The value of resilience. I learned a new narrative. The furnace is traumatic, definitely. Importance of education. No word for please, numbered. Trauma, Bev's courage, parallels to the Shoah, which is another word for the Holocaust. Indigenous injustice. And as people write the same things, that phrase gets bigger in the word cloud. So a few people have written that they were surprised there was no word for please. Splintered communities. There's lots coming in. Survivor, skills, resiliency, the gangs. Intergenerational trauma, for sure. Not just a chapter, powerless. And the power of hope. So I'll leave it there for this prompt. We can share a screenshot of this page afterwards, because I think that it's really interesting to read all of your thoughts, and I might have missed some, and I know some are coming in, not just a chapter, coming in even larger. The next prompt I want to do, and I think it should come up on your screen as well, is what is something you would like to do now that you've learned about this history?
You may have to click at the top of my screen. It said the presenter has changed the slide, and it has a button say go to slide. So you may have to do that to get to the next slide.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Jordana. Learn more, cancel Canada Day, reparations, read your books. I definitely want to read the books. Outreach to community, research the different treaties, spread awareness, educate, share this information, watch more speakers, work with Indigenous people, how to reconcile as an individual, tell my friends, share the information, take political action, research my local history, pressure the government, change government, don't walk away, show respect, have empathy for others. That's all really excellent things. And I think when you teach one person, you teach many, because we can all leave this talk today and tell our friends and tell our families what we've learned, and we can tell them to read Bev's books, which will allow them to learn a bit more about her story as well. So the biggest words coming up here are educate and learn more. So I'll leave it at that for this activity. Thank you everyone for participating. We can share this afterwards. And I'll pass it back to you, Jordana.
So I think I'm going to formally conclude the event now. Like I said, people can stay around if Bev is willing to stay for a few minutes and meet Bev, because she's absolutely amazing and I'm very inspired. Thank you for joining us, and we are so glad that you were able to take time out of your night to learn this important narrative on this important day, National Indigenous Peoples Day, like I said. We're getting so many messages in the chat now, Bev, and we really have the entire night just honoring you and thanking you for your strength and courage and for sharing your story. And I know from your book and also what you said tonight that it wasn't easy to start speaking about your story. And it gives all of us, it empowers all of us to really be strong and do something about this, because you're strong enough, and to know about this because you're strong enough to tell your story. So thank you for that. If you'd like to support Shadowlight, please click the link there, and you can help us do the important work that we're doing, and really invest and support young people, bringing education around social justice, around tolerance, and important narratives to light. And I hope everyone has a wonderful night and thinks about just how privileged we are to be sitting here today and discussing history and joining as a community, coming together and talking about these important issues with Bev. So thank you, and I hope we'll all continue speaking and taking action. Okay. Let's end the recording, Haley. And